Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
A lot of devout Hindus, especially my informants in the book, feel that the Sikhs have betrayed the Hindu fold by creating their own religion and walking away from it. So one of my informants says quite sort of angrily that, they've abandoned us. ये मानते ही नहीं हैं कि ये हिंदुओं की औलाद हैं, and it's such a rich quote because there's so much happening there. There is this idea of paternity. This also happens on the other side where you have Sikh fundamentalists, most famously Bhindranwale, who actually wanted to establish Sikh paternity as different from Hindu lineage. And this was a major thing, establishing the genetic purity of the Sikhs. So part of what I wanted to do was bring these out from these sort of very private spaces where these things are hushed but deeply felt and put them out in the open. Because we need to talk about this. This is problematic. We are sitting on a tinderbox here.
The book Memories in the Service of the Hindu Nation, The Afterlife of the Partition by anthropologist Dr. Pranav Kohli presents the findings of an extensive ethnographic study conducted over 14 months, focusing on survivors of the partition from West Punjab and the Northwest Frontier Province. The research was conducted in Delhi and its surroundings between 2017 and 2018. The author explores the connection between the global rise of far-right nationalism, the process of globalization, and the memories of victimhood. Specifically, the book delves into Hindu nationalism in India, shedding light on the tragic consequences that can arise from a history of trauma. The central question posed by the book and this conversation with Pranav Kohli and writer, researcher, and lawyer Prannv Dhawan is: what does it mean to remember the partition in the time of fascism? Kohli and Dhawan discuss the experiences of displacement and everyday violence resulting from the political policies of partition, drawing relevance to the current global context of forced displacement across national borders. Through an analysis of trauma re-encryption in partition memories and its correlation to the justifications of contemporary Hindu nationalist violence, Kohli elucidates the cycles of violence and the ways in which Hindu nationalism shapes the narratives of Hindu partition survivors. By examining the deployment of memory to reinforce notions of national belonging and exclusion, Kohli contributes to the understanding of the increasing xenophobia in multicultural democracies. The book addresses the perplexing phenomenon of how mob violence can be attributed to outsiders without individuals recalling or acknowledging their own acts of violence. In this episode of BIC Talks, Dhawan speaks to Kohli about his analysis linking memory, sacrifice, and theodicy, offering a novel conceptual lens to connect the partition of India in 1947 with contemporary, homegrown Hindu fascism, and provides thought-provoking groundwork to anthropologists studying religion, nationalism, and memory, as well as researchers focusing on modern Indian cultural politics. And now, over to Dr. Pranav Kohli and Pranav Dhawan.
Thank you, Lekha. I am super excited to be interviewing Dr. Pranav Kohli about his book, Memories in the Service of the Hindu Nation, Afterlife of the Partition of India. The book is out soon by Cambridge University Press, and we are going to be talking about what led Pranav to write this book, what was the process that he followed, what makes this book special, not just to him, but to the academic and political community, and what are the few takeaways that we can take from this book. Why don't we start with Pranav, you telling us, why did you write a book with this long title?
So the story of this book actually begins in 2014 when I moved to Ireland to pursue my master's. I was doing this program called Race, Ethnicity and Conflict. It was a master's program in a sociology department. And it was a strangely dislocating experience to move abroad to Ireland. And it was in this sort of very European and white environment that I realized that I was a brown man. I sort of discovered my racial identity by being outside my own homeland. And it was in this context, while I was learning about race and nationalism and ethnic conflict in the classroom, that the memory of the partition became relevant to me. Now, at this time, when I was living in Ireland, My next door neighbor was a dean, and he was from Pakistan, and his father was born in Calcutta. We had another friend, Mavish. We're all still friends, by the way. And Mavish's grandmother was born in UP before the partition. So it was really interesting to sort of be with these people who were technically not from my country, but who reminded me most of home. And the sort of the intermingling of partition and our national identities sort of became very real to me in that moment. So when I had to do a master's thesis, I decided to do a small oral history on the partition, and that was quite well received. So then I decided to sort of expand that into a PhD thesis, and that then became this book. So that's kind of where this book actually comes from.
Pranav, your book is a systematic effort to link partition and today's homegrown Hindu fascism by using a novel conceptual lens linking memory, sacrifice, and theodicy. Please tell us a little more about the argument that you're making through these lens.
So the main sort of question that animates this book is, what does it mean to remember the partition in the time of fascism? What does it mean to remember the single largest event of retributive genocide that was triggered by religious nationalist passions at a time when India is going through a process of redefining what it means to be Indian and redefining it in terms that are explicitly Hindu nationalist? So ultimately, this book, in remembering the partition, is not just about remembering the partition. It is about asking why we need to remember the partition, and also how is the partition remembered differently by its last generation of survivors at a time when Hindu nationalism has become part of the discourse of Indian politics. What are the ways in which Hindu nationalism transforms or colors memories of the partition? You see, when we talk about memories in sociology, we don't see memory or memories in plural as a given, as something that is static through time. See, memories change, memories are fluid, memories are social constructions. The process of remembering is the process of remembering these events that happened at a certain time and remembering them in a certain order that makes sense of them. It is inherently a process of meaning making. And oftentimes you'll find that individuals remember the same event differently, depending on the context in which they are remembering it. So essentially, this book is an effort at analyzing memory reflexively, at examining memory as a social construction and seeing how memories of the partition are constructed or how the partition is remembered in this very turbulent political moment that we are going through.
Thanks, Pranav. I can't resist asking you this question. When you're talking of different people remembering the same event differently, why is it that in the memorial account that you're choosing, it's about a number of upper caste Hindu that you are speaking to? Is there a particular relevance of speaking to this class of survivors while talking of our homegrown Hindu fascism?
Some of that was the result of my snowballing methodology. Essentially, I asked the most elderly people in my family to introduce me to other partition survivors. And that's how I found a whole community and a whole network of partition survivors. And every time I met a partition survivor, I asked them to introduce me to some of their friends. And so that's how I sort of went around and found over 50 partition survivors. Now, the fact that they all belong to the same caste and the same sort of upper caste strata of society, and they're all middle class or upper middle class, that is a result of the methodology, of the way in which I have found people. But I also chose to make that a strength of my analysis by focusing specifically on the positionality of these narratives, right? So interviewing upper caste and affluent partition refugees is not a problem if I actually examine how their position in society makes them remember the partition in certain ways and how it makes them relate to contemporary society in certain ways. So I've actually made that the reflexive strength of my book.
Thanks, Pranav. And I realized there's another link between you and the subject of your study, which is that you belong to a family that traces its roots to the trauma of partition. And even I am someone whose family had to relocate from Pakpatan and Lailpur to Ludhiana. So I would like you to share how this personal experience, which is shared by millions of people, affect you in the way that it led to your doctoral work and then your book. Because when anyone reads your book, it is clear that it is largely from the memorial archive of people who are the closest to you in their ethnic, social, religious status that you have done this anthropological study in. and at whom you have secured all these deep insights from?
So, when you grow up in a house with elderly partition refugees, one of the things that you will realize, and I'm sure this is common with your experience as well, is that there is a certain pall of silence over the partition. We know that our grandparents came from across the border, but how many of us have actually sat down and got them to tell us their whole story? How many of us know the details of what they went through? In my fieldwork, I posed the same question to other informants that I met. And I said, do you and your grandchildren talk about the partition? Do you and your children talk about the partition? And they said, we don't talk about these things because these are not nice things. Ye achhi baatein nahi hai. One person said to me that, if there is some problem in the house or if there's conflict or tension, then you talk about these kind of things. Not the partition, but you talk about these kind of things. So there is a pall of silence. So when I turned to the partition, I wanted to break this pall of silence. I wanted to learn more about my own community. Who are we? I knew that my maternal grandparents were from a place called Dera Ghazi Khan. And I'd never heard of Dera Ghazi Khan in the news. It's one of those backwaters of Punjab that you never really hear about. So I wanted to know more about this place and just about this region, this sort of Western Punjab that we don't hear about a lot from. So when I started looking for people, I used the snowball methodology. So I spoke to the most elderly people in my family and I asked them to connect me with their friends. And sort of hopping through their social networks like that, I got in touch with the All India Miyawali District Association, which is an organization that was founded by refugees from Miyawali. And this organization back in the day helped resettle members of this community. But the organization still has a number of active members who are partition refugees. So that's where I found a large section of the people that I interviewed. I also found a community of partition refugees from Bannu. And, I talk about them in the book as well. And they became quite close to me. So I guess the short answer is that I was just trying to find out more about my own community and more about who I am and where I'm from.
And I think in a way, your book contributes to a legacy of oral history, material history, projects around partition, but it also goes a step forward, or it goes a step aside, I would say, from that genealogy of work on partition. So given that legacy, what did you do differently? And more importantly, how did you do it?
So there's two ways in which that question of what I did differently can be answered. The first is that I did something that was quite methodologically different, which is that I relied more so on long-term contact and participant observation. Quite simply, I wasn't compiling an oral history that was made up of one-off interviews with people. I wanted to actually get to know people. I wanted to become part of the furniture of their homes, in a sense. I wanted to embed myself in these communities. The community of Bannuwal refugees that I found in Faridabad, I had a routine of spending about 2 evenings in a week with them in the park. And, sometimes we talk about normal things, just gossip. Other times we talk about the partition. And sometimes I'd go there with directed questions that had come to my mind because of other fieldwork that I was doing. But other times we were just hanging out. That emotive aspect is quite different in this work. The other thing, of course, is that I like to think of this as an anti-fascist take on the memory of the partition, because you cannot remember the partition in a time of heightened bigotry, at a time when the idea of who is an Indian and what is India is being redefined in explicitly religious terms. You cannot remember an event like this in this time and not talk about the interlinked histories of these two processes. So I wanted to specifically address the Hindu nationalist use and abuse of the memories of the partition. And I wanted to see what survivors of the partition make of Hindu nationalism today. So those are the two ways in which this work is different, methodologically as well as politically.
What I found very interesting in this answer and in your book is that it's not just a recounting of the sufferings of the people and how they rehabilitated their lives. It's not a story of that. It's more so a story of what that suffering means and what that rehabilitation means. And starting with the suffering, you used the idea of theodicy to explain the sort of human suffering and death that was encountered by your informants. So could you speak a little more about that?
I use this term theodicy, which comes from the work of Max Weber, and it's sort of embedded in classical sociology and religious studies. The classical meaning of this term is that theodicy is any attempt at reconciling death and suffering with belief in a meaningful cosmos. In simple terms, what that means is, if you're a good person and something bad happens to you, you feel that it is unjust, and you might ask yourself, why do bad things happen to good people? Other sort of religiously motivated questions like, why does evil exist in a world that has been created by a benevolent deity? This is essentially the problem of theodicy. Why do bad things happen to good people? And why, if we live in a meaningful universe which has been created by a God who is just and good and who loves us, why then does suffering and evil exist in this world? Why has a perfect deity created an imperfect world? Right? That is the religious origin of this question. But Max Weber took this question from religious studies and gave it a sociological touch. And so he came up with the idea of secular theodicies. And what that essentially means is that we often deploy theodicy-like thinking to explain general experiences of death and suffering. So the reason that I turned towards this was because over the last 25 years, there has been a very visible turn towards recording the memories of the partition. And one reason for this is that the last generation of partition survivors is dying. These are the last years in which we can do oral histories like this. And so that is motivating this work. But when I sat down and looked at this literature, I also found that this was animated by the problem of theodicy. Essentially, people were remembering the partition because on a fundamental level, it does not make sense to us. And these attempts at remembering the partition, at conducting historiographical analyses of the partition, at understanding the high politics of the partition, that age-old question of who caused the partition. Was it Nehru? Was it Gandhi? Was it Jinnah? These are all attempts at explaining or trying to understand something that is almost ununderstandable. This is a gaping void at the heart of our modern contemporary history, and we do not understand the partition. We cannot fathom suffering and death on that level. And so it is against this void, this societal level of trauma, that we try to remember the partition and make sense of it. So that is why I speak of theodicy. And this again is what makes my work different as well. When I turned to partition survivors, I didn't want to just talk about Dera Ghazi Khan. That's interesting to a point, but how valuable is it in a scholarly sense? What I wanted to know was, how have they rationalized the death and the suffering that they have endured? How have they made sense of the fact that one fine day they woke up and were uprooted from their homes and had to witness this hellscape of violence and walk through it and somehow find safety and a new sense of identity and a new life in an alien land? How do they make sense of this? So that is why I turned to the question of theodicy.
That void, I think, is pervasive, especially when we think about the memorial archive of partition. And I think that void about who caused it, why do we suffer this, remains unexplained, and I think maybe is possibly not a non-volitional void. It is possibly volitional. The fact that we all know that mass-scale violence happened, but whenever we speak to those close to us, none of them have had any role of their loved ones to play in any violence. It's something that is not questioned, and we all choose to be participants in that void about what was partition. And this, I think, remains enmeshed with a lack of reflexivity in the understanding of partition. And I think it's particularly so in the context of violence. And if you could say a little more about what happens in the discourse around violence, who caused it, and who tends to cause it.
So I believe it was Yasmin Khan who was one of the first people to say this as starkly as she did. And what she said was that silence and guilt stalks the partition archives. And what she meant by that was that we have so many of these narratives from the perspective of victims, but we have almost no perpetrator narratives, right? And I think that's what you're getting at as well when you talk about this being a volitional void. But there is a slightly other issue as well, which is in the way that trauma is deployed in sociological literature. And so for me, this question of perpetrator testimonies and the absence of perpetrator testimonies actually begins with a certain way in which trauma has been deployed through partition literature and through most of literature on genocide, which is that in the modern sense of the word, trauma implies a victimhood tag, right? So to say that someone has endured a traumatic experience means that they are the victim. So trauma is part of how we express the universally morally unacceptable trait. So let me give an example. Say you had an insanely long commute. You were stuck in Bangalore traffic for 5 hours. You get home and you're going to describe this experience as traumatic. Now that does two things. On the one hand, what you're saying is that what you endured was morally unacceptable, right? This is unacceptable. It's traumatic. This shouldn't happen. The second is that I am a victim of this event. Now, this is somewhat problematic when we apply trauma as a sort of general category across everyone who remembers, right? And this is for multiple reasons. Modern sociological literature on trauma comes from the Holocaust. And in the Holocaust, you have a fairly simple juxtaposition of victims and perpetrators. In the partition, it's more complicated. So, number one, we know from historiographical literature, from testimonies on the ground, that a lot of the violence in Delhi, especially against Muslims, was done by Hindus and Sikhs who were displaced from Pakistan. So there was a sort of cycle of violence. People who were displaced from one side came over here, and they took their revenge out on minorities here. And the same happened on the other side, and it kept escalating, right? And that's what we know of as the cycle of retributive violence of the partition. That's one thing, that victims on one side of the border were also perpetrators on the other side of the border, often the same set of people. That's one. Number two, in the context of the partition, we have forgotten a lot of the specifically gendered violence of the partition. And a lot of this was uncovered by Urvashi Batalia and Ritu Menon and Kamla Bhasin through their work, which is that there is a certain memory of the heroic sacrificial suicide of women during the partition, that Hindu and Sikh women would rather jump in the well and commit suicide than face dishonor at the hands of the other. Now, their work has actually shown that these women did not go to these deaths voluntarily, that often they were coerced into these deaths. So what that makes this event then is an honor killing of a sort. So again, where do we speak of trauma here? Whose trauma do we speak of? So the perpetrator-victim dichotomy is very complex when you talk about the partition. And there's another level of complexity here as well, which I talk about in my book through the story of one of my informants, which is that he admitted that at the age of 16, he was an RSS member, and he used to spend his time training with the RSS. He learned how to use a lathi, he learned how to fire a gun. They used to have these drills where their superiors would dress up in these long kaftans as Muslims, presumably, and they were then sort of expected to chase them through the street. And this was, a way of training and preparing for violence. Now, as I was listening to the story, I asked myself this question, and I pose this to you and to our listeners now as well. How far are we willing to trust the story of someone who drilled for genocide, who trained for genocide? How far are we willing to believe that this person never actually participated in violence? You see, in his narrative to me, he always talks about this as preparing for self-defense. But how far are we willing to trust that this person might never have committed genocide? I'm not saying they have, I'm just saying how far are we willing to trust?
That brings me to a very natural question, which is the kind of difficult conversations you've had with your informants. And I would like you to speak more about how was it like to speak to elderly people, many related to you by blood, about these things, and to not be totally combative, but at the same time having a critical stance to the narrative that they were delivering to you. So how was that experience like? Because in the book, you have contradicted the narrative that you received from your informants multiple times. One of your relatives tells you that the violence against the Muslims was mostly done by the Sikhs, because Sikhs tend to be very martial and violent. So these racialized stereotypes, which were often deployed in responses to your queries, how did you respond to them, and how was it like not just to do it as a part of the anthropologist job, but also as someone, a thinking, feeling human being?
So again, I have to take us back to methodology here. I'm an anthropologist, and our main methodology is ethnography. Ethnography is a complex thing, but at its core, it is a relational practice. You see, we study social relations by participating in them. So when you say that you can see that I had these difficult conversations and that I formed a sort of genuine emotional bond with my informants, that is what anthropologists do. We study social relations by participating in them. We become part of the communities that we study. That is just what is expected of me in methodological terms. And I think it actually makes the book special in a way. When I was doing my fieldwork, I felt that I had 50 grandparents almost, and some of them I became quite close to, like Puran Chand, the Banuwal refugee whom I used to see in Faridabad. We were quite close, and I used to really enjoy spending my time with him, even outside of talking about the partition. He was just a genuinely nice person. There were others as well, like Gangaram and Bhavrilal, and these are all pseudonyms, by the way. And, though we had differences of opinion, I think what I liked most about it was that we were all able to sit together across the table and have a conversation and even have disagreements. And it never got uncivilized or toxic. So I think I really appreciated that, because in the current climate, I think we've forgotten to do that. We've really lost that ability to have an honest political discussion where we can talk about our differences of opinion and where it doesn't get personal, violent, murky, or toxic. I think our politicians could learn a lesson or two from that. But the other question that you raised about the denial of the violence of our own community, right? So my granduncle in one of our conversations said that the Sikhs were the ones who were responsible for most of the violence in Delhi because, they're a martial race, they're violent by nature, etc., etc. And there were others as well, like Bhavri Lal said something similar. And, there's a whole chapter on this that I have where unpacking this narrative and deconstructing it step by step. This has a long genealogy, right? And on the most basic level, it is a denial of the violence of our own community. It is quite easy to just look at Sikhs and go, you know what, they're responsible for violence. Us Hindus, we're peaceful, we're tolerant, we're the best. Ganda kiya hai, unhone kiya hai. It's their fault. So there's denial, that's one level. But there's also something a lot deeper that's happening here, which is the racialization of Sikhs as well. And this idea of the Sikhs as a martial race, this is colonial Orientalist historiography, right? That's where it actually originates from. So it's just sad that continues. And in the year 1984, we know where this kind of politics leads, that Sikhs are not immune to the violence of Hindu nationalism. And I've talked about this contestation between the two as well. And this is both religious and political. On the one hand, a lot of devout Hindus, especially my informants in the book, feel that the Sikhs have betrayed the Hindu fold by creating their own religion and walking away from it. So one of my informants says quite sort of angrily that, they've abandoned us. Ye mante hi nahi hai ki ye Hinduon ki aulad hai, And it's such a rich quote because there's so much happening there. There is this idea of paternity. This also happens on the other side where you have Sikh fundamentalists, most famously Bhindranwale, who actually wanted to establish Sikh paternity as different from Hindu lineage. And this was a major thing, establishing the genetic purity of the Sikhs. So part of what I wanted to do was bring these out from these sort of very private spaces where these things are hushed, but deeply felt, and put them out in the open. Because we need to talk about this. This is problematic. We are sitting on a tinderbox here.
And beneath that tinderbox also lies the narrative of victimhood and the received label of a Sharanarthi. All the informants and the host of partition survivors today migrated and were uprooted from their lands and were given the term of a Sharanarthi, a refugee, as one would say. How do you think they navigated, accepted, and processed this tag? And is the word Purusharthi a response to it?
So I think at this point, it's helpful for me to actually explain what the words Sharanarthi and Purusharthi mean for the non-Hindi listeners. So Sharanarthi comes from Sharan, which means refuge. So a Sharanarthi is someone who seeks refuge, a refugee. A Purusharthi, that's a complicated thing, and we'll come to that in a bit. But let's start with this whole idea of Sharanarthi. So when partition refugees arrived in North India, they were labeled as Sharanarthi by the local population. But they actually resent that tag. Because partition refugees continue to argue that they are not Sharanarthi, they are not passive refugees as they see it, they are Purusharthi. So what does Purusharthi mean? Now, Purusharth is a term that is part of the sort of fourfold values of Hinduism, and it's closely connected to moksha, dharma, and it is essentially it refers to a certain way of living one's life. Purusharth refers to the idea of living a virtuous and sincere life through honest efforts. I think that is the best English translation that I can provide for Purusharthi. So a Purusharthi is someone who does that. But this meaning of Purusharth is canonical. This is what Purusharth means in Hindu religious discourse. The way that my informants use Purusharthi is different. For them, Purusharth refers to hard work. And to be a Purusharthi is to be someone who is self-sufficient, who labors, who works, who earns their own bread. And so when they heard the local population here describing them as Sharanarthi, they pushed back and said, no, we are not Sharanarthi. We have not come in your Sharan. We are not your dependents. We are self-sufficient Purusharthi. So, on one level, this discourse is about reaffirming agency, right? It's about establishing their control over their own life. It's about restoring a certain amount of dignity. It's also associated with a certain sense of honor, right? Of communal honor of the community. We are not a community of sharanarthis. We are a community of hardworking purusharthis. But what's interesting here is that the more you listen to these narratives of Purusharth, you find that Purusharth is also described as a form of sacrifice. So a lot of the people that I spoke to said that we are not Sharanarthi, we are Purusharthi. We have sacrificed and worked hard for this nation. We are not victims, we are hard workers. We are people who have committed sacrifices. And this later is also used to articulate certain claims on the nation. That we are entitled to this, this, and this because we have suffered sacrifices for the nation.
That really makes me wonder whether the idea of Purusharth or hard work is linked just to meritocracy, or does that also hide beneath its surface a claim to a lot of privileges and services that the partition survivors, especially from the class and caste that you investigate, had towards the nation? Your book in clinical detail talks about the kind of concessional housing that was providing, land titles that was granted, job assistance that was given. How are these welfare measures from the state, which work studied by you, by Ravindra Kaur and others, shows was very racialized and ethnicized? Upper caste refugees who had land titles before partition were given a different degree of welfare entitlements from those who are, let's say, lower caste and did not have land titles. So tell us more about this debate between a meritocratic Purusharth versus an entitlement to welfare services.
So that's a major chunk of the book. So my first response there is just read the book. But no, I'm just being cheeky. It's a long answer, but let's start at the beginning. To be a Purusharthi, or when we start talking about why they wanted to describe themselves as Purusharthi, we need to understand the larger dialogical complexities that they were facing as newly arrived refugees in a newly created nation state. The compensation system that was created, the rehabilitation system, actually looked down on refugees with a certain level of suspicion, because the Indian government had promised land in exchange for land. That if you had, like you said, land titles across the border that you had been forced to abandon, then you would be given compensation for that lost land in terms of land up to the ceiling limit of 10,000 rupees. And aside from that, to claim this compensation meant that you had to go through a whole bureaucratic process, which involved scrutinizing a person's history and particulars and documents and all of that. So to the refugees, it looked like the state was suspicious of them. And this is what Ravindra Kaur talks about in her book, that the state seemed suspicious or distrustful to the refugees. And to a certain extent, it was. Refugees responded to this by exaggerating their claims for compensation so that they would get something. What's interesting is that this process is a deeply humiliating process, if you think about it. For a person who has to go through this, it is humiliating and it feels like a loss of agency and honor to have to beg before the state for what was yours. And this loss of honor and agency is then recovered through memory, through remembering yourself as a Purusharthi, as someone who would not beg, who would not ask, who sat on the street and sold buttons. And that is how they rose up and became middle class again. Someone told me that as a child, they used to sell toffees in a train. And, that is how they helped their family survive. Another informant whose story I tell in great detail, Mahinder, he talks about how as a child, he used to ride a rickshaw around Ambala. And that is how he paid for his own schooling. He didn't even want to suffer the indignity of asking his principal for a scholarship. So he would earn his school fees himself by riding a rickshaw at night. He would study under the lamppost when he could, and this is how he put himself through school. You have to understand what's happening here on an emotive level. So we have suspicion, so people exaggerate their claims. This is then felt as a loss of honor, which is then recovered in memory through these stories of Purusharth. What is also interesting, and I forgot to mention this earlier, is that while people talk about these stories of, very hard, physical, masculine labor as Purusharth, they also brand acts of street smartness as Purusharth. Now remember, the canonical meaning of Purusharth, as I said earlier, was all about virtuosity and sincerity, right? So street smartness is an interesting flip here. So one of the stories that is often told among refugee circles, partition refugee circles, is the story of a famous Punjabi sugar seller who apparently sold rate for rate sugar. So what he used to do was he used to buy a big sack of sugar from the wholesale market, and then he used to sell it by the kg for the same rate that it cost him in the wholesale market. So his sugar was obviously cheaper than the other people, right? So someone asked him one day that, how do you earn your money? So he says, it's simple. After I've sold all the sugar in the sack, I dust out the sack, and that gives me another half kilo, and I sell that. And then I sell the sack to the kabadi wala, and that gives me a certain amount of money. And so if I sell more sacks, I get more gunny sacks to sell, and that is my earning. So he was making money on volume. Now, we don't know if the story is true or not, but Ravinder Kaur's book mentions a version of the story. I heard a version of the story, and I heard other stories that sort of fit this label of street smart labor. Not hard work especially, not sincere work, but just clever and street smart work.
That's really fascinating, to be honest. And it touches upon the deep emotional register where the partition was felt and responded to. And, in that context, I want to bring up this one new word I learned from your book, which is ressentiment. And that seems to be another response besides the street smartness, besides the feeling of hurt, besides the expression of purushartha and meritocracy. And I would like you to tell us more about what that word means and why you think it explains a lot about the memorial account of the survivors whom you encountered.
So ressentiment is a French word, and it means resentment roughly, but also something more. It refers to a kind of self-righteous outrage or a very toxic jealousy. This has its connection with theodicy. So remember what I said about theodicy, that theodicy is an attempt at reconciling experiences of death and suffering with belief in a meaningful world. That if we live in a meaningful world that is created and run by a benevolent and kind deity, then why does evil and misfortune exist? Theodicy is the answer to that question, right? Theodicy explains the gap between the two. It answers that question. But what happens when theodicy fails? What happens when you have something like the partition, which completely destroys your faith? And I mean this very literally, which completely destroys your faith in humanity, in society, but also in God. How do you come back from that? Now, my book argues that Hindu nationalism is used as a form of theodicy by partition survivors. That Hindu nationalism, with its gloss on history, with its explanation for lack of a better phrase, Muslim behavior towards Hindus, offers some kind of an explanation on why the partition happened. And that's one level on which theodicy works. But when you listen to partition survivors talk about Hindu nationalism and the partition, you realize that even Hindu nationalism per se doesn't explain everything. There is this gaping void at the heart of the partition, which is that, why the hell did this happen to me? There is a deep amount of anger about this. And this is where ressentiment comes in. A sort of toxic jealousy that I was living a good life. How dare they take me out of my home, make me a refugee, and reduce me to this state of being? It's a toxic jealousy. And I call it toxic because in the politics of Hindu nationalism, there is this deep-seated desire for revenge. Revenge not just for the partition, but for what is seen as 1,000 years or 800 years of Hindu victimhood. That we have been oppressed, we have been conquered, we have been enslaved. How dare they? We are going to get them back. That is ressentiment, and it is a very deeply emotional thing. But what does this have to do with Indian politics in the here and now? What is interesting is that there is another term that I'm going to throw in here, which comes from the work of Arjun Appadurai, which is called democracy fatigue. And this best describes how we have come to see democracy in India today. I'm using that we in a very loose sense, right? We as a nation at large. Democracy fatigue refers to a fatigue with democracy, which is that democracy is something that is seen as in the way to national progress. So comments like the one that Amitabh Kant made, who's the Niti Aayog head, and he said this in response to the farmer protest. He said that, India struggles to develop and reform itself because we have too much democracy here. That is the best description I can give you of democracy fatigue. And ressentiment and democracy fatigue are kind of related. Because on the one hand, you have this toxic jealousy of the other, this self-righteous outrage where you want revenge, this very visceral feeling of revenge. And on the other hand, you feel that you are held back from progress, from justice by democracy. And the two mix in a way that makes many people in our society today feel that our democracy has been hijacked by self-interested politicians and by self-serving minorities. That our nation doesn't serve us. Our systems don't serve us. They only serve them. What is the solution? Capture everything, change everything, burn everything.
It does paint a very sobering account of what this memorial archive, especially the one that you have accessed, has in store for the future of our country. And I would just like to mention one conversation from your book where you ask a question to your informant. So what is your solution for all this? Do you want a Pakistan for Hindus? I mean a country like Pakistan, but only for Hindus? My usage of Pakistan here was meant to critique Hindu nationalism's dream, but my informant's response let the penny drop. Your respondent said, we in fact want this to be a Hindu Rashtra. We want to remove the nonsense of secularism from the constitution. We want Article 370 to be removed so Hindus can build houses there. Your informant further went on to add, BJP should return to power in 2019 with a 2/3 majority and conquer 3/4 of the state legislatures and have sufficient numbers to rewrite the constitution. Do you think that this memory of partition in this context is bound to be in service of the Hindu Rashtra? Or can some remnants of it be recovered for a genuinely secular democracy that we all set out to build?
So let me begin with the sobering stuff first, and then I'll come to the more optimistic stuff. That conversation that you referred to was a very long and difficult conversation that I had with my informant Gangaram. And he's a very interesting person. I mean, when you read the book, you'll find out more about him. It begins as a story of hope. He seems like someone who is incredibly warm and he was a very nice person, I have to say. Very hospitable, very generous. He'd been to Pakistan 22 times since the partition. He had links across the border. He'd revisited his own home. In fact, the people who are now living in his ancestral home, and they'd effectively occupied it, had allowed him to build a small 2-bedroom unit where he could stay. So every time he went to Pakistan, he would actually live in a small part of his own home, which it means a lot. And so when I met him, his story seemed like a different story. But as I got to know him further and further, I realized that aside from all of this, he's also quite Islamophobic and very gung-ho about Hindu nationalism. And so it was in one of those conversations where we were talking about politics that it got pretty stuck. And that's when we had that conversation. Where do we go from here, right? What's important to understand here is that, and this is the most sobering stuff that I promised, to most of the partition survivors that I spoke to, when I say most, I mean like 99.99%. When you talk to them about what justice means, what reconciliation means, it means revenge. And you can read that subtext in the way that they remember the partition, in the way that they talk about contemporary politics, in the way that they talk about Muslims. That the justice that they're hungering for is actually just revenge. And there's no going back. There's no healing this rupture. That's the sobering stuff. Now, whether or not the partition will always be in the service to the Hindu nation, I don't think so. That's why I wrote the book. I wanted to produce a counter-narrative. What I wanted to argue, and I wanted to argue this by demonstrating it through my research, is that there are other ways to remember the partition. We can remember the partition while confronting the dark and the stark stuff that lurks in the background, right? The Islamophobia, the hatred. We can also say that we don't agree with this. Yes, partition survivors want revenge. But is that what we want for our society? Yes, bad things happened in 1947, and I feel for it more than anyone else, believe me. I'm not kidding when I say this. I needed therapy after I did my fieldwork. I actually needed therapy after I did my fieldwork. So the question that we have to ask ourselves now as we continue to remember the partition is, what kind of society do we want to live with? Do we want to live with a society where we see a repeat of all the things that happened that led up to the partition? Or do we actually want to use the partition as a reminder of where the politics of religious nationalism leads? This is where communalism leads us. It's a stark lesson for us. Let's learn the lesson of history and not go down that route again. Because then we're just repeating cycles of violence. Now it'll be some version of some community taking revenge on someone else. 8 years later, the cycle will repeat. Someone else will want revenge for something else. And where do we go from there? We're just stuck in a cycle of killing each other again and again and again because someone somewhere wants revenge. Because we have convinced ourselves that violence is the only form of justice available.
Well, that indeed strikes at the heart of what we expect democracy and a system based on rule of law to be. And while you did promise an optimistic note, I was just hearing a cautionary one. So do you really have an optimistic note, Pranav?
I have a small optimistic note, which is that in the conclusion of my book, I also talk about the limits of Hindu nationalism. You see, this is not an invincible juggernaut. And I don't mean that in electoral terms. I mean that there are limits to the politics of hatred. Hatred cannot identify itself as hatred. When it does, it loses the ability to be popular and to win elections through the kinds of slim electoral majorities that it is able to manufacture at the moment. And you can see this in the kind of post-truth politics that we've seen around the CAA and NRC. You see, we know that together the Constitutional Amendment Act of 2019 and the National Register of Citizens, when combined, actually weaponized the law in a way that would disenfranchise a large section of Muslims from this country. We know this is the actual intent of the law. But at no point can the leaders of Hindu nationalist politics ever go on record and say this publicly. They have to settle for saying it through hoodwinks, through dog whistles. And that is essentially one of the limits of Hindu nationalism. You can see it even in the way that we talk about Gandhi now, for example. So there was an MP, I think Sadhvi Pragya, who said that she was an admirer of Godse. I think her exact quote was that she called Godse a national hero. And there was a lot of outrage about it, right? Because you just called the man who assassinated the father of the nation a hero. And what's interesting is that the Prime Minister said that he will never forget Sadhvi Pragya, but she's still in Parliament. But on the other hand, even though we know that the Hindu Mahasabha actually sympathizes with Godse, they in fact had an event a couple of years back where they held up an effigy of Gandhi and someone shot bullets at it and there was a whole incident. This happened in, I think, 2018. Even though the Hindu Mahasabha and a lot of Hindu nationalists behind the scenes are quite vocal in their sympathies for Godse, they can never say that in public from their high constitutional offices. When the Prime Minister goes abroad, he has to talk about Mahatma Gandhi as one of India's greatest political and cultural exports. On 2nd of October, the Prime Minister still has to go to Rajghat and pay his respects to Gandhi. There are limits to these politics, and these limits can be exploited and exposed. We just need smarter strategies to do it.
Well, thank you for that call to action. And I guess that's potentially an optimistic note to end this conversation on. It was a pleasure speaking to you, Pranav. Thank you for writing this book.
It was a pleasure being here. Thank you.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, please share it with family and friends. You can also leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible are Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studios. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. Do follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to get regular updates on our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at PIC.